In the physical world, that's very hard to kind of get around because there's actually physical items. In the software world, though, much easier to kind of do this iterative innovation and experimentation. As you mentioned, there's still a lot of regulatory IP issues and things like that. Now, part of this is I always go back to the framework of the laws on the books are only as good as the enforcement, right? And so the US and Europe has done a very good job of enforcing these laws, right? And that's kind of why I think you're getting that stifling that you're describing. The difference is now in today's society, there's this idea of decentralization, right? So we've seen that with things like Bitcoin, where it's a decentralized system. There's no leader to call into in front of Congress or call and arrest or do things like that. And so one of the frameworks I've been very interested in is Facebook came out and said, hey, look, we're going to do a digital currency. And immediately Congress freaked out in the United States and called in a bunch of executives and, pretty much took them to task and said, no, you're not going to do this. And, why would you do this and all of that. I wonder how much, going along this line of thinking of if there is this regulatory regime that ends up being stifling, is decentralization of all sorts of things, not just kind of what people would consider cryptocurrencies and things like that, but other types of software. Does that become a more important trend? Because actually what it does is it very much mitigates the ability to enforce the rules on the books. Again, not every industry can do this, right? Obviously physical items and things like that are much harder, but in software specifically, maybe that is, kind of the way that people and innovators can fight back a little bit to continue to push the pace.
I think that's a really interesting idea, and I think it's a very important concept. And I think blockchain generally enables us to move the next phase of innovation from California or China or wherever things are not being looked after right in terms of regulations into the cloud, into a place which is stateless. And once we do that, and they really can't get at us for to prevent innovation, then surely we can do a lot of good. That would be the hope. But of course, you can immediately see by me telling the story in that way what spooks people, and particularly politicians and journalists, about that story. But because I ended that sentence with the word good, you and I could float off into the ether and do something bad if that happens. And I think the jealousy of states with respect to currencies is as nothing to the way the lawyers are going to react when we say we're going to have a completely different legal system that is not tethered to any territory but is in the sky, and it's done through blockchain. Monopolies don't like you doing end runs around them, and they fight like tigers to reimpose their monopolies. So the jury's still out on whether blockchain can achieve that goal of giving us a sandbox in the sky, if I could call it that, where we can do the experiments that we need to do to produce new technologies and new ideas, or whether down here on Earth, governments will rein in these things. I think, I often think one of the most profound things said about innovation was Amara's law, which I mentioned in the book, which is this guy called Roy Amara, who was a computer scientist and futurologist in California in the 1960s. And he said, we underestimate the impact of a new technology in the long run, but we overestimate it in the short run. And this feels to me spot on. When the internet is just starting, we start to have wild ideas about e-commerce replacing retail and replacing everything else, and we invest like crazy in dot-coms, and then after a few years everyone says, this isn't really working, actually. It's not made much difference. The world goes on as before, and everyone gets very disappointed, and you get a dot-com bust, and then 10 years later turns out the dream was right. So I think the same will happen with blockchain. In about 10 years' time, if we're having this conversation, we'll be saying, well, didn't really work, did it? All the blockchain ideas, all the crypto ideas, they kind of came to nothing. 10 years after that, we might be having a different conversation saying, actually, it worked.